Okay, we're going to start with the putting the collar together. Now the collar has this is a drill. So on the right side it has the twill weave, and you can see here. So there's the under collar, which is not interfaced. The top collar is interfaced, and the same with our collar stands here. So we need to put top with the top and the underneath one with the underneath. And what you'll also find too, which can be a bit tricky, is the fact that like you automatically go to do that, so you want this curve to fit into this curve, but the way that the collar is constructed is that it actually gets sewn onto the collar this way. And that's because this here, around this seam here, it's a little bit smaller, so it sits closer onto the neck when it goes around to the neckline here. So that's why I've got these notches here. So this notch here, so this notch here lines up with that, and even though there's this big step here, remember that I've got 6mm seam allowances, so the seam allowance actually continues 6mm all the way down to this point, and the notches are there really just to hold it together and to make sure that you stitch correctly. Now, there we go. Just make sure if you've got like this twill weave, I just have to make sure that I've got the twill on the top side here, and I'm just going to match up my notches there and start here. And I'm going to sew this in black, of course. For a real thing, I'd sew it in red, but it's just so that you can see. So I've matched up those notches. Now I'm working my way to the center back. I have center back notches on both of my collar pieces. This has got a bit of a scoop here, so I have to make sure that I can pull the underneath one around so that the raw edges match. So, you know, that's a big part of sewing, is just making sure that the pieces are in the right place so that when they're sewn together you get the seam allowance that you need. So here's my notches on the other side here. Just sew that together. Okay, so I've sewn that along at 6mm. Just long thread off. Now what I'm going to do here, just before I get onto the top collar, is I'm going to push the seam allowance down towards the collar stand, and I'm just going to run a pin stitch around here. So you have to run the pin stitch through the seam allowances. So you go through the under collar, through the top collar seam allowance, and then through both seam allowances underneath. And what that does is holds that seam allowance down. So you can see now that that's been done, see how that curves around the neckline and holds the collar down. So you get a much nicer shape than if you just had a one-piece collar. Let's do the top collar. So again, this is a bit easier because I've got interfacing on the wrong sides. I didn't put the notches into the interfacing, so I'm just cutting those notches through now. Really important when you're doing 6mm seams that you only have 2 to 3mm notches, so you don't cut all the way into the seam allowance, because if you cut all the way along then you'd end up with holes on the outside of your garment. So just lining that notch up there, again starting there, working towards that notch, matching the center back notches, pulling this around, matching the notches here. Okay, so I've sewn my top collars together. Now I'm going to do the same thing as I did with my under collar, and I'm going to pin stitch these seam allowances. And make sure here that you're actually sewing through all of the layers sometimes what happens is that people think they do an understitch, and rather than stitching on the seam and stitching through all of the seam allowances, they actually stitch here, so they're actually only sewing through one layer, and it's not actually holding that seam allowance down at all. So there's our top collar. Okay, so we're going to stitch around the collar, stitch the top and underneath collar together. And we're going to do this in two stages. One is we're going to stitch along the top edge here, because then we can do an understitch, and then we'll stitch the ends closed. So what I'm going to do here as well is I'm going to match the points here, but as I come along, I'm going to take it out. So by the time you get about 7 or 8 centimeters, you've got a 2 millimeter gap here. And what I'm doing, I'm still sewing the seam allowance at 6 mil, but that 6 mil is only on the top collar. And you can see that the under collar, I'm pulling that out. So the seam allowance on the under collar is actually about 8 millimeters. And the reason I'm doing that is because when you've got it on the body, you don't need as much fabric on the under collar, and it just sort of like bunches up underneath. So we're getting rid of that, a little bit of that. And what would happen if you were doing this in production and you were doing like several thousand of these, or even several hundred of these jackets, you would make a separate under collar piece. So you'd have, this one would actually be cut back the 2 millimeters, and so you would have the raw edges together. But because I'm only doing one, I can manipulate the fabric. Now what we're going to do, we're going to run along here. So the understitching is going to go on the under collar, so all the seam allowances have to go towards the under collar, and then an understitch like we've just done with the stitching on our collar stand here. Which we don't call this an understitch, but it's really the same method. Okay, so you can see here that now that when I fold this down, you'll see that the under collar, which is this one here at the moment, is a little bit shorter, and that's because, so when you have this on the body and you fold this down, you have less fabric under here, because otherwise it just bunches up. So that's how it works around on the body, like this. Okay, so we've done our understitching here. You can give it a press now if you want to, and just to give that seam allowance a press. And now we're just going to stitch up the ends. So I'm keeping all of these raw edges together here on this edge, and you can see how like automatically this seam allowance wants to tuck under, so it wants to go underneath towards the under collar. Okay, so 6 mil all the way along there. Okay, now usually I wouldn't actually cut away the corner here. If it was a right angle, I would leave this seam allowance here, but because we've got a point and we have to get this seam allowance to go inside that point, I am going to give that a little trim away, that corner there. On the other side here. Okay, so now I can fold this one back and poke through that corner. And it will take a little bit of manipulation here. So you see it's squared off at the moment because of the bulk of the seam inside. So what I'm going to do is get a needle and just put it into that little groove there that's been made. Now I'm really just putting it in there and easing it out. So you just you're using the pin to push the fabric out. So you don't get in there and pull it like this, because then you can end up grabbing onto threads and pulling threads out, so you'll have little threads sticking out of the corner here. So that's one corner pulled through. Now this one, and when you fold these corners as well, as you mentioned it before, just fold it to the under collar and then poke it through. Okay, so that's worked quite nicely there. Okay, so the last thing we're going to do here is we're just going to secure these two neck edges together on the collar. So, and you'll see here there's a notch along the way, and that notch is the shoulder notch. So we're starting here at the front neck, and we're working our way around to the shoulder notch to hold those two together. And working again to our center back notch here, making sure raw edges are together there. And the stitching that I'm doing, because this is really just a stay stitch, I'm actually doing the stitch inside the seam allowance. So there's no chance that it will be seen when we're doing the insertion of the collar into the body of the garment. I'm just making sure this under collar wants to roll out a little bit, so I'm trying to make sure that it gets pushed under and that you don't see the under collar from the top when you're sewing these two layers together. Okay, so you can see that's our finished collar, and see here that because we've understitched, the under collar has rolled underneath, and so you get, when this goes on the body, you won't get you won't see any of the under collar when it's sitting on the body.